Hi and welcome back to my channel. Today I thought we were going to do a new series, sort of, right? It's about Caesar, right? And it's about his battles, and we saw his year, right? Caesar's years, when he got things done. And this is after he got his political stuff done. This is more of his military campaign, right? So this is Caesar versus the Helvetii, I think it's pronounced. This is 58 BC, right? BCE. Before Common Era instead of before Christ, but whatever. Original videos down below. Let's go.
Remember back to Caesar's year as consul, when there had been a coordinated effort to sabotage his career by assigning him to govern the woodland and country lanes of Italy. After achieving dominance over the Senate, he had replaced this dead-end job with the governorship of two provinces, Illyricum and Cisalpine Gaul. Governing two provinces at once was unusual, but not unprecedented.
That's true.
When the governor of neighboring Transalpine Gaul unexpectedly died, he had that province assigned to himself as well. By the way, for the sake of simplicity, I keep on using the word governor, but the Romans used the words proconsul and propraetor, which doesn't exactly mean the same thing. Basically, if the Senate took a former consul and put them in charge of a province or at the head of an army, they were now a proconsul, which legally granted them some of the old command authority that they used to possess when they were in office. Command authority. The Romans had their own word for this too, imperium. A person with imperium was authorized to channel the power and authority of the state in order to enact their will. So governors, generals, judges, and high-ranking politicians literally embodied the Roman state. Diplomats also had imperium. There are famous stories about the over-the-top arrogance of Roman diplomats, talking down their noses at foreign kings.
I mean, it makes sense because they are, instead of being a representative of the government or the state or the people, they are that. They're not the representatives, they are that. So they have a sort of pompous kind of sway with them, right? Because they're representing the entire empire or republic, but they embodied being that, right? They are in charge. They're sort of being their own kind of dictators, right? Not in our terms, but in their terms, right? They have more power than normal people have, right? They're not just representing, they are what they are representing. Which could be pretty bad if you're a diplomat, because you're not actually that diplomatic, but you know.
But look at it from their point of view. If Roman diplomats thought that they were the embodiment of the Roman state, it would be inappropriate for them to bow to a foreign king.
It's true.
Easy to see why the Romans were awful diplomats. Another thing
I don't know if they were awful diplomats, but because they made alliances throughout what they would call barbaric tribes and whatnot in like Gaul and nowadays Germany, right? In Europe and in Asia and in Africa. Right? But okay.
Keep in mind going forward. A person with imperium was immune from legal prosecution. You could always charge them later as a private citizen, but not while they had imperium. So, on January
that makes sense also, right?
BCE, Caesar became the proconsul in charge of Illyricum, Cisalpine Gaul, and Transalpine Gaul for a 5-year term. These 3 provinces had a total of 4 legions assigned to them, which at full strength would have been around 20,000 men. Caesar immediately began raising 2 more legions at his personal expense, bringing his total up to 6 legions and 30,000 men. Last year, when Caesar had secured new provinces, he had also given himself the power to appoint his own legates, which was usually the Senate's job. Just a reminder, a legate was the person in charge of each legion, so in this case he had 6 jobs to fill. He gave one of these positions to a man named Labienus.
Which I mean, again though, it makes sense why Caesar shouldn't do that, because the legions are military forces for the Republic, and the Republic is the Senate and the people, right? So but again though, he had imperium, so isn't he the state, right? Because he has imperium, so he can do that, right? Even though it's the Senate job. but he has imperium, so he embodies the state, and the state chooses who's going to be the legates, the leader of the legions, right? So, you know.
Caesar and Labienus were the same age, and they had become good friends during the Catiline conspiracy, when Caesar had served as praetor and Labienus had been a tribune of the plebs.
Okay.
In Caesar's year as consul, Labienus had served with him as praetor. This made Labienus eligible for a province of his own, but instead he chose to come with Caesar and serve as his right-hand man.
Wow.
Later, when Caesar would get distracted by the day-to-day governance of the provinces, Labienus would be left in charge of the army. When circumstance required Caesar's presence elsewhere, Labienus would govern the provinces in his place.
I mean, this embodies what Napoleon has and Alexander the Great has, or had. Respect of their men, right? And their generals, commanders underneath them. Labienus could have just gone to the Senate and be a consul in the Senate or whatever, right? But he chose to follow Caesar because they both rose in the ranks together, and Labienus rose faster in the ranks than Caesar, probably thanks to Caesar, right? Okay.
When Caesar's
loyalty
term as governor ended, he would have Labienus appointed his successor.
Wow.
Near the beginning of the year, Caesar received word that a large tribe, the Helvetii, had uprooted and were migrating west.
I mean, it looks like on the map that the Helvetii, where they started on here before they went somewhere, it looks like that's like Switzerland, right? Or yeah, it looks more to Switzerland and a little bit of France, right, nowadays.
Their current trajectory,
I don't know if there's a connection there.
Caesar ordered his legions to mobilize and to travel to the edge of Roman territory near modern Geneva. There he had them break down a bridge over a river that the Helvetii would need to cross. When the Helvetii realized that there were 6 legions standing in their path, they formally requested passage through Roman territory.
Makes sense. Let's not forget that a lot of these tribes have, like I said, diplomatic connections and whatnot with the Roman Republic, right? Alliances, right? Trade alliances, whatever agreements, right? So, I don't know.
Caesar sent a response, saying something along the lines of, "Wait there, I'll think about it." A week passed in silence. Finally, Caesar sent a messenger denying their request, at which time they discovered that the Romans had secretly constructed a 28-kilometer line of defenses in front of the...
Wait, 28-kilometer defense? In a week? This is what's so cool about Caesar, which is actually one thing that is sort of not what Alexander the Great did and Napoleon did, right? This is sort of one thing that sets them apart, right? He builds a lot of fortifications, defenses, bridges, like Napoleon did as well, but very quickly. And again, at this time as well, right? And Napoleon had some great engineers, but these guys on another level.
River. What was Caesar doing here?
Yep.
If you want to give him the benefit of the doubt, you can. He would argue that the Romans were allied with many of the Gallic tribes in the area, and they didn't want 300,000 militaristic Helvetii moving into their territory and upsetting the delicate balance of power. But in my opinion, Caesar wasn't acting in good faith here. He had started mustering extra legions before the Helvetii had even entered the picture. If you ask me, this had more to do with Caesar settling his debts than it did with maintaining the status quo.
I mean, that's fair enough argument. It could be both. It could be that Napoleon has heard a lot of rumors about tribes moving more west or southwest to get nearer Rome, right? To settle there because it's more profitable or whatever. They can get more food, trade, whatever. Maybe a citizenship in the Roman Republic, right? It could be both. I think it's both, right? Because even though it is both, because even... Daisy! I think it's both because even though, let's say, that is Caesar's debts, but if the Helvetic tribes are attacking or going into the other tribes' areas and disrupting their lives there, right? Then, I mean, that's a fait accompli. It doesn't matter what Caesar's thing in the beginning was, because the Helvetii tribe did what they wanted to the other tribes there. But okay.
The Helvetii were upset by Caesar's refusal. Some of them were like, to hell with this, and decided to independently cross the river anyways. Caesar had anticipated this. He didn't have enough men to defend the entire 28-kilometer line at once, but wherever a group of Helvetii tried to push, Caesar and his men converged on that location.
Makes sense.
The Helvetii made several attempts over several days, but Caesar repulsed them every time.
Yep.
The Helvetii were beaten, and decided to go around Roman territory by marching north.
But I mean, let's think about this tribe. What was it, 200,000? I mean, most of them are probably women, children, old men, old women that don't fight, right? And they have wagons with food and all of that, right? Their possessions, right? Their belongings. And a small portion of them are military-age men or in a sort of combat role, right?
For too long, some of Rome's Gallic allies started to get word of a massive Helvetii migration coming their way, and sent panicked messages to Caesar asking for assistance. With this thin justification, Caesar set off in pursuit of the Helvetii, and caught up with them at the Arar River, which we now call...
But I mean, this is a do if you... What is the quote? Damn if you do, damn if you don't. So if Napoleon didn't take these messages seriously, the Roman Republic will come, or the Senate will come down on on Caesar, saying, you should have done something, they are our allies, blah, blah, blah. But then, if he did something to respond to the Gallic allies, then the Senate will also come down to him saying, you shouldn't chase them outside the borders of Roman Republic, right? It is a do if you damn, or damn if you do, damn if you don't, whatever that statement is, right?
The Helvetii were having difficulty with the river, and a simple crossing had dragged on for weeks. Caesar launched a surprise nighttime attack, but due to low visibility and general confusion, he was not very successful, and most of the Helvetii on his side of the river were able to retreat safely into the woods. The next morning, Caesar and his men started construction on a bridge across the river. They were finished within hours, and the next day Caesar and his 6 legions had crossed the river, and they were on to attacking the rest of the Helvetii. When Caesar caught up with them, the Helvetii sent a diplomat to meet with him. They didn't really accomplish anything, they just ended up airing grievances at each other. It now seemed pretty clear that there was going to be a battle. Caesar assembled his legions and sent his 4,000 cavalry forward to screen his infantry as they advanced. The cavalry walked right into an ambush. The ambush was small in scale, but the Romans still took heavy losses and were routed. This was Caesar's first proper military encounter in Gaul, and it ended in defeat. But it could have been a lot worse. At least the cavalry took the brunt of the attack, and were able to disengage when they were beaten.
Which they're supposed to do,
it could have gone a lot differently. After this, Caesar must have felt humbled, because he moved much more cautiously. The Helvetii continued their migration north, and Caesar shadowed them the entire way. Whenever they stopped moving, the Helvetii would deploy for battle, but Caesar never took the bait. This went on for several days. One day, the Helvetii ended their march in front of a steep hill. Caesar pulled Labienus aside, and together they hatched a plan. In the middle of the night, Labienus was to march off with 2 of Caesar's most experienced legions. The plan was for Labienus to march all the way around the Helvetii position.
Makes sense.
And take the hill behind them before the sun came up. At dawn, Caesar would march out and deploy for battle. Labienus was to hold his position until the moment he saw Caesar's forces come into contact with the Helvetii. When that happened, he was to charge downhill and hit them in the rear. A key ingredient to this plan was trusting that the Helvetii wouldn't be stupid enough to attack uphill, even though they would outnumber Labienus's detachment 7 or 8 to 1. If they did attack uphill, that would screw up the plan a little bit, but all Labienus would need to do was hold off the Helvetii until Caesar could come to the rescue. That's why he had the 2 most experienced legions with him. So in the middle of the night, Labienus marched off with his legions, and at dawn, Caesar and the remaining 4 legions marched out of their fortified encampment to meet the Helvetii, making as much commotion as possible. He sent his cavalry to scout ahead. Before long, his scouts came back, with reports that there were Helvetii all over the hillside, and Labienus was nowhere to be found. This was bad.
Uh-oh.
Caesar abruptly threw his legions into a defensive line. Then he sent out all of his scouts with very simple orders. Find out what happened to Labienus's legions. They stayed deployed like this all day, prepared for an overwhelming attack, but it never came.
Okay.
Finally, the scouts came back. Labienus had been waiting on the hill the entire time. The first report had been wrong. The Helvetii had been completely unaware that anything was going on.
Wow.
Caesar must have been pretty angry because when he was writing his account of this incident 12 years later, he names names and throws the scouts responsible under the bus.
Wow.
By this point, it was near dusk, so Caesar sent a messenger to Labienus, telling him to abandon the plan and come back to camp.
What?
The next day, Caesar finally had to deal with the fact that his army was down to 2 more days of food. Some of his Gallic allies had been promising a food shipment for a while now, but these were Gauls of questionable loyalty, and so far none had arrived.
Wow.
There was an allied Gallic outpost nearby, and if the Romans left first thing in the morning, they could make it there by sundown. That was the new plan. Caesar would get the food himself, and then he would continue to shadow the Helvetii.
I mean, it makes sense because I thought when he recalled Labienus, why did you call? You cannot just attack. But okay, he needs food and supply. That makes sense, right? I mean, they built another bridge in like hours and then crossed the next day. I mean, what is that engineering? Maybe the river is not that big, but still, it's a pretty large force, right?
The Romans marched away, but unbeknownst to Caesar, it was his turn to be shadowed. Caesar had just begun his forced march to resupply when all of a sudden he had Helvetii attacking the rear of his column. He didn't see this one coming. The infantry at the rear of the column turned to fight, and Caesar ordered all of his cavalry to go and help them. There was a small hill nearby, so he repositioned the rest of his infantry there and had them deploy for battle. This may have taken several hours, especially since Caesar had 10,000 raw recruits under his command.
Yeah.
He put his 4 experienced legions up at the front, and his 2 inexperienced ones in reserve. When the infantry was finally in position, a signal was given, and the Romans who had been holding the Helvetii off fell back to the Roman line. The Helvetii...
I mean, think of this. They had to hold back the entire force of the Helvetii. I don't know how long they fought, what they fought, if it was just a line just to distract Caesar, I don't know. But I mean, that's pretty cool and gutsy to have just one legion holding off the entire force and the cavalry, but still.
Advanced slowly up the hill, and the Romans held their ground.
Uh-oh.
When they were in range, the 4 legions at the front threw their javelins and sent their first 2 lines charging down the hill. The fighting was evenly matched for some time, but the Romans held the high ground, and the Helvetii...
But I mean, me just looking at this animation, shouldn't the Helvetii use their numbers? Right, I understand what they're doing, and Caesar has 2 legions as reserve, but they're less experienced than the force at the front, right? I don't know. Okay.
Gradually started to be pushed down the hill. Suddenly, a 3rd army entered the battlefield. 2 local Gallic tribes had allied themselves with the Helvetii. They had been sluggish in their pursuit of the Romans, but all 15,000 of them arrived with the battle already in progress.
I mean, this could change the entire battle. And that they were sluggish in the pursuit of Caesar makes sense because they may be hesitant to attack Caesar, right? Because maybe the alliance was forced upon them by the Helvetii, right? Could be that, but let's see how this goes.
In this period, it was very common for armies to commit most of their men in the first wave, in the hopes that their overwhelming numbers would cause a rout. The Romans...
Which we see a great example from the Helvetii, right? They have all the force at just one point. But the Romans, especially Caesar, he has his not entire 4 legion in front engaged in the battle. He has some veterans from the 4 legions in front that are still not activated, and the 2 legions who are not activated at all.
Let's see. Weirdos, and their system kept a large percentage of their army in reserve. But it was designed for moments like this. The Roman 3rd line was a cross-section of the most experienced soldiers under Caesar's command. There were, at most, 6,500 of them, but probably less. And when they moved up, they stopped the 15,000 Helvetii reinforcements in their tracks.
Look at that.
Neither side had a clear advantage, and the battle dragged on all day. Caesar held his raw recruits back. It wasn't clear that they were capable of holding their own against the Helvetii, and Caesar didn't want to risk it.
I mean, it makes sense because even though you can say, oh, he should use them, but another battle could come the next day he needs them. Or if he puts unexperienced soldiers there, they could break under the fighting because they're unexperienced. And then that could rout his entire army. Right?
The Romans kept on making incremental progress here and there, but it was exhausting work, and both sides were taking heavy losses. The sun went down and they were still fighting. Eventually, the Helvetii had been reduced by an astonishing 2/3, and they pulled back, dejected and thoroughly beaten. The Romans were totally exhausted, even in victory.
Yep,
they had
he has reserves,
5,000 men, which was a quarter of their most experienced soldiers.
Yep.
Caesar's army was truly shaken, and it took them a full 3 days to recover and tend to their wounded. They had captured some Helvetii supply wagons, so their food problem was now taken care of. Once the Romans were well enough to be on the march again, they were immediately met with a Helvetii delegation offering terms of surrender. Caesar accepted. He had the Helvetii hand over all of their weapons, allowed them to leave Gaul with their lives and go home, on the condition that in the future they would provide fighting men to the Roman Republic upon request. They agreed. This was the beginning of the so-called Gallic Wars, a series of campaigns that began here in 58 BCE and ended in 51 BCE, just after the Battle of Alesia. Campaigns that began ostensibly to stabilize neighboring Gaul by restricting the movement of people, ended with its subjugation.
Yep. Alright, that was a great video. Short video, but still was great. It was just about Caesar and the Helvetii. And that's sort of the beginning of the Gallic Wars, right? And he let them leave Gaul and go back to their homes. Although I think a lot of these tribes who are going to cross the Rhine and go into Gaul from East Europe or Germany, I think a lot of them burned their homes and all of that to not have something to retreat to, right? It's a psychological thing to do, right? You have nothing to return to, so you pursue what's in front of you, right? Alright, that was great. I'll see you in the next video. Bye!